In 1889, Copper King W.A. Clark and 74 other men wrote a state constitution to serve the needs of Montana's powerful interests, with a weak governor, a secretive legislature, and special tax deals for the powerful. After 60 years under the copper collar, Montana was declared the nearest thing to a colony of any American state. The Anaconda Mining Company even owned most Montana newspapers, the Copper Press. The corporate dominance of Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. 70 years after statehood, the Copper Press was finally sold, and thousands of World War II veterans had been educated under the GI Bill. Newly enlightened Montanans wanted out from under the copper collar, and big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Changing Montana's constitution was the top priority. Strengthening the governorship, opening up the legislature, empowering citizens. Voices of Montana women, totally silenced in 1889, rang out loud and clear for these changes. When the Constitutional Convention began, 19 women were among the elected delegates. And when the delegates came together in convention, Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, men and women, young and old, sat alphabetically as equals, Montanans just wanting to make their state better. And so they did, producing a constitution for the ages, the last best constitution. Now, at its 50th anniversary, Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time shine a light on the creation of this remarkable Montana Constitution.
Welcome back to Last Best Constitution. This series of episodes about Montana's 1972 Constitution are happening and being recorded during the 50th anniversary year of the Constitution, which was created through a constitutional convention in 1972. And what we're trying to do with our series here is to acquaint you with the people who were deeply involved with the creation, the delegates, the research analysts, the key staff people, and to get an understanding of the situation of the times, that the desire for change among Montanans that led to a new constitution. And of course, the seeds of the 1972 Constitution were actually sown by the 1889 Constitution, which had been in effect for 83 years. And that Constitution was written by the powerful interests of 1889, and by the way, with no women president, as women weren't even allowed the right to vote at that time. But it was written by the powerful interests to serve the powerful interests. And it did so very well for 83 years. And Montana chafed under what was commonly called the copper collar, the strength of the Anaconda Company, its allies in the larger business world, set up a constitution that provided favoritism for them and provided a weak government, because they didn't need a strong government. They had a weak governor, a secretive legislature. These were things that started to really bother Montanans at the time as we were into the 60s and into the 70s. And in addition, the Anaconda Company, the real corporate giant, one of the largest in the world, it was headquartered in Montana. The Anaconda Company owned all the newspapers in Montana except for one, all the daily newspapers. And so that was called the Copper Press. So it was under that kind of control and oppression, if you will, that Montanans post-World War II and with the enlightenment of the GI Bill and kind of the enlightenment of the period began to say, look, we need some change here. And the primary way to change things in Montana was to change it through the Constitution. And so essentially we ended up with a Constitution that changed from corporate power to citizen power. And that's what we're addressing in this series. And we've had a series of wonderful guests, and today we have a very special guest who's, we're doing our first combined studio Zoom discussion. And so joining us from Washington, D.C. is one of the research analysts from the convention, originally from Shelby, Montana, James Grady. James, welcome.
It's great to be here, Evan, and thank you for doing this series. it is very important for the people of Montana now and tomorrow to understand where and how this Constitution came from, and that there were regular human beings that helped get it to life.
Yeah, it was really a marvelous group. Of course, I have such a great deal of respect for all of you who were research analysts who really helped set the stage for the delegates themselves who came from the grassroots. That was one of the marvelous things about it, was legislators, for example, and other office holders could not serve. So we had everything from a beekeeper to retirees to farmers and ranchers and preachers and
It was a situation where the entrenched political powers of both parties
right.
would not use the same system they've been using in the legislative process since Montana become a state. I was even go further back when it was just before the Constitution of the 1800s. It was a time when ordinary citizens suddenly had a chance. I mean, like there was a radio DJ. There were small town businessmen. They all
newspaper editors. We had some newspaper editors there, small county newspaper editors.
It was. I mean, it was. I can't emphasize enough the difference of excitement between this and any other statewide political movement that was going on, and the real sense of responsibility and the need for integrity that all the delegates and the staff brought to this situation. We felt like we had to be our better selves, and maybe even our best selves if we could. This was the shot, and a lot of us were lucky enough to be part of it.
You know, staying with the delegates and that process a little bit before we introduce you a little bit more, but when they decided to not sit Democrats on one side and Republicans on the other, but to sit alphabetically as equal citizens of Montana. That seemed, according to every delegate I've spoken to, that they thought was a critical decision that was made that made a difference for everybody who was there working together.
Absolutely. It changed the feel. And remember, this was in the very earliest hours of the convention. It changed the feel of the convention from a partisan situation to a people's situation, and it was a brilliant move.
Yeah, well, it clearly did make a difference, and I'm often tempted to say that we maybe ought to pass a little statute in Montana that says they ought to do it in the Montana legislature like that, and maybe even Congress for that matter, although they don't sit that long in Congress, but in the legislature in Montana, they sit there and they grind it out. And, you know, I've often thought maybe we ought to sponsor that, you know. Anyway, Jim, you're originally from Shelby, and
right.
Tell us about your path from Shelby to the Con-Con.
Well, I'm one of those lucky people whose roots in Montana go back to 1884, when my family settled the country north of the Marias, and in fact, Shelby gave us a parade in 2014. For having done that. My dad, in my formative years until I was a junior in high school, managed the movie theaters in Shelby, Cutbank, and Conrad. So that I grew up in a world of cinema about the outside world, which was terrific.
By the way, Jim, I had never heard that before.
Oh,
and
yeah.
So,
my mother.
Yeah.
My mother eventually became an assistant county librarian.
Yeah.
So I was brought up in this external world of movies and books, dialing in rock and roll radio from KOMA, Oklahoma City. It was in our town. We loved the reputation as being the second toughest town in Montana, with Butte being in first place. And it was everybody in the town when I was growing up there, for the most part, had been there from the beginning, or their family was, and there was just beginning in, I want to say, about 1960. Yeah, about 1960, a class structure. Before that, there were the rich guy in town was exactly the same as the poorest cowboy. My grandpa was a cowboy, and he dealt cards in the saloon in the wintertime. And then my grandma, this all on my maternal side, was a midwife, and on my father's side, my people were homesteaders, came later. So I have roots, as we say in Montana, that go way deep, and the state never leaves me. Shelby never leaves me. It's been key in everything I ever did.
So you ended up at you went up to UM then?
Oh yeah. We had a bit of an economic setback in my junior year, so I was fine with going there anyway. I was definitely a B student in high school. Didn't make the top 10 out of 88, but I didn't care. I was following really this innate drive of mine to be a writer, and Missoula was what was open to me, and it was so lucky I went there, because that allowed me to, rekindle a friendship with Rick Applegate, who was the research analyst for the Bill of Rights Committee, and, about 45% smarter than me. And I got to have a feel of the state and the people there at the University of Montana that was extraordinary. And I thank my stars that one day I came back for a independent studies quarter after I could have graduated in 71, because I thought I needed the umbrella of the university to be a creative writer. And I'm walking across campus, and a graduate student from the journalism school grabs me, takes me to an interview with the education department. 2 days later, I'm face to face in Helena with Dale Harris, who really, along with Jerry Holleran, should have the most credit for creating at least the initial force of the Constitution. I'd applied to be work at the convention before, and they turned me down. I previously had a national fellowship to be on Senator Lee Metcalf's staff for 3 months. And this time they needed someone who could write fast. And there are many things I can't do, but you put a keyboard in front of me, you let me know what you want, you let me know what we're supposed to do, and I can click it like a machine gun.
Yeah. And so you ended up in front of Dale, and what did he give you an assignment at that point and took you on board?
Dale was in the midst of, which I only found out later, massive reorganization and budgetary issues. They had lost, I think, one of the original commission research analysts had some personal issues and had to resign. And initially I was brought in to pick up the education committee. And the same day he's interviewing Bruce Sievers, PhD, Rhodes Scholar, former U.S. Senate aide, just a brilliant guy. they quickly gave him the education department, or the education issues, and I was given to Rick Applegate as an assistant until they realized there were little bits and pieces of the constitutional process that needed to be grouped together. And they created the General Government Committee that would then became Suffrage and Elections also, and gave it to me. So I was handling, things that that never even got talked about in the convention.
Yeah.
And creating a report real quickly based on other states' efforts, like Hawaii's, for example.
And by the way, just for our viewers, that we have 2 wonderful 1-hour sessions with Bruce Sievers and with Rick Applegate that I hope they'll enjoy as well as this one. So there you are. You're in the middle of the Constitution and you're doing your work. And let's take a second, because of the import of the subject matter, to touch currently, which is to touch on suffrage.
Right.
That seems to be a major issue these days. And I was looking here at the Constitution to see that we have our right of suffrage is a right in our Bill of Rights, so to speak, which gives it real strength. It's not just another subject in the Constitution. It's in our specific rights. And I'm looking at it here under Section 13, and here's what it says. It's very strong. It says, right of suffrage. All elections shall be free and open, and no power, civil or military, shall at any time interfere to prevent the free exercise of the right of suffrage or the right to vote. No one shall interfere. And that language is so strong. Tell me how controversial that, since it's controversial today, how controversial was that back then?
Well, it wasn't controversial at all, because that particular section was worked on, I think, with the Bill of Rights Committee also.
Right.
And all the delegates came from communities in Montana where usually the elections were run by the county clerk and a group of volunteers who were paid something ridiculous, like $12 a day to sit and from 8 a.m. in the morning to 8 p.m. at night and manage the electors who would come in person, and there were military absentee voters. There were not many absentee ballots in those days in Montana. And we all felt, not just the delegates, but the staff, we could never have imagined that there would be any controversy about free elections being able to be run by the people of the local communities with a minimal amount of help from the state government. It was, they might needed the state government to give them a new voting machine because their last one had broke down. But nobody was talking about election fraud, about bad voters. There was a sense that we left that behind when we left behind the copper collars of the Anaconda Copper Company. And that since really just before World War II, everybody felt the elections were free and safe, that they should be, and they always would be. I mean, it was really, I don't want to say that we were rubber stamping a reality everybody believed in, but we were just making sure that the right for every Montanan to have his vote counted, to cast his vote physically. There was some discussion about, well, maybe we should keep the polls open earlier or open later because of farmers, essentially, and for people who had to travel like 60 miles to the county seat. But that was decided that that the citizens themselves would be able to handle that. that it would work there. They could always do an absentee ballot if they thought that was going to be a problem. Nobody thought that in 2022 there would be any need for interference of any level from private groups or from government groups or pseudo government private.
You know,
coalitions.
I think that in 1972, because I was with the Democratic Party at that time and in Montana, and clearly the objective of everyone was get as many people registered as you can and get as many people out to vote as you can, and don't have any impediments in the way of that. And it's
Right.
What a radical change to now, instead of there's a bit of a sense among some folks that instead of trying to persuade people to your cause, it's to take the people that don't agree with you and make it harder for them to vote.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think, and I'm not certain about this, but many communities closed the bars.
Yeah. Oh,
So
they did in the old days. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, and that was done so that because we had seen what happened in places like Chicago. I mean, that was one of the examples I'd studied, and that people remembered having seen during the days when the copper collars rule of getting essentially regular citizens drunk, taking them to the polls, having them sober enough to go in and cast their ballot. Nobody wanted that anymore, and it was considered. Those were the old days. Those were we were modern Montanans in 1972 and 71 when I was there with the commission. Those days, they were considered like the bad nightmares we had when we were children.
Yeah. Let me take a second, because again, I like to have everyone know well the people who are talking to them. Take us through a little path, and we'll go back to the Constitution, a little path of your life post-convention and what directions it took.
Sure. I always wanted to write fiction. I mean, that's since I was 5 years old. That was all I really wanted to do. And I traveled around the country right after the convention, which was many of us in the research staff did. I briefly held a state job, and then I went away to be a freelance writer in Missoula. And within a very brief period of time, I sold my first novel. It was called 6 Days of the Condor. It was immediately bought as a vehicle for Robert Redford and became the movie 3 Days of the Condor. Well, that launched my career.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I qualified for and got the Lee Metcalf Fellowship for a year for journalists, and I think academics and lawyers were the ones who.
By the way, that's a mark of distinction in my book. The list of people who were Metcalf Fellows is an amazing group of people.
Oh, I often, again, I felt like, do they really know who I? I felt it was, and for me, being there in 1974 during Watergate, that was an astonishing moment. After 74, in part because I didn't know how long this fiction gig was going to work, I spent 4 years as an investigative reporter for syndicated columnist Jack Anderson, who in that era was in 1,000 daily newspapers. Now, the idea that we had 1,000 daily newspapers is already mind-boggling. And to me, getting to be a muckraker, basically my job was to go out and fight bad guys.
Well, Jack Anderson was the ultimate muckraker of the time, and he was the successor to Drew Pearson, right?
Right.
Right. And so when Drew Pearson, who was the big muckraker, retired, Jack Anderson became, and you then were doing his legwork and stuff.
And Jack was less partisan than Drew. Drew I went back and looked at some of his columns, and they were you could tell when he'd made his mind up. But we tried to be nonpartisan. I went there to help out for 3 months. I spent just over 4 years on his staff in D.C. Then I continued with my fiction career. I think I've published. I hate to give a number because it feels like bad luck, but I've published over 14 or 15 novels and maybe 40 short stories. I've written for network television, HBO, CBS. I had a couple things filmed that that were completely changed that I never want to see again. And I've just been, yeah, I know. I'm probably one of the luckiest people you're interviewing. And I've been able to make a living and have a great family and family life here inside the Beltway. My daughter is an Academy Award nominated documentary maker, and my son is an entrepreneur in tech and had been in the service industry. My wife is a former private eye, U.S. Senate aide, an ABC TV producer who's just finished her first book. So, I've had this great life, and at the heart of it, at the very heart of it, is my moral and political sense that I got to be part of helping my fellow Montanans who raised me get a chance to have a political structure that will allow our descendants the freedom and opportunities that we have.
Tell me about your brief discussion about the import of this with Lee Metcalf.
It was one brutal day in the Nixon administration, and we've been working late, and I was a staffer assigned on that day to be there for Lee. It's about 7:00 at night in the halls of the Senate office building, and he's saying, Jim, I got it from here. I go on home, and we've been talking about Montana, and I said, Senator, I think that the most important thing that I will ever do, and this is when I was like 26, is to have been a research analyst for the Montana Constitutional Convention. And he leaned in, and Lee was a big guy. He leaned in and he said, Jim, I think you're right. And he had such respect for the convention and the people who did it. And he was such a champion of it. I mean, and actually 3 of us, Bruce Sievers, Rich Bechtel, and I, were fellows who worked for him. So he was a real influence on the convention.
In fact, one of the fellows was Delegate Jerry Cate, had been a fellow.
Absolutely, I forgot about that.
Yeah, Jerry had, but he was a delegate.
Right.
It's interesting. Of course, Lee. Mike Mansfield always referred to Lee as the most preeminent legal mind in the Senate, and Lee had such respect for the law, and of course, nothing could be more important to someone like Lee than that foundational document of a Constitution. And so I'm sure when he was leaning in, it was reflecting his being, because a lot of people don't even remember that Lee, in addition to being a legislator, had been a Supreme Court justice before he went to Congress.
He got very emotional. Yeah. I mean, in that one clause, I don't want to say he was close to tears, but he was
intense.
Intense.
Lee could be intent. In any case, well, thank you, and by the way, I appreciate what you say about being blessed with that. I've always said that the biggest blessing you could ever have, and I know that I've had that in my life, is to be able to get up every day and go to work and get paid for doing something you'd be willing to do for nothing.
Oh yeah. I would have, I would have done the convention work I did. for nothing as long as I could have a roof and, at least 2 square meals a day. But it was a great atmosphere to work in. I mean, the commission, which we started with, was a small group of us. Dale was busy taking care of everything, so he was part of that. Jerry Holleran was our true leader, I would argue, and we would get to work around anywhere from 7:30 in the morning to about 8:15. We would work until about 5 o'clock, go have dinner somewhere, usually, if not together, we would do, and you'd come back about 6:30 and you'd be standing in line to use the Xerox machine with your other research, and you'd be there till 8:30, 9 o'clock at night. And, I remember the very few times we wouldn't be doing that. We had a sense that this was the most important thing we could be doing with our life.
Yeah, that's terrific. In our discussions that we've had in the past, not on screen, I've been taken with your reflections on some of the things that the sense of the times that was going on. That you as research analysts were reflective of the time and active in the time. And for example, this was just in the Vietnam War. Protest period was still going on, and
Sure.
I think there was a protest story you told me about that I think might be entertaining to reflect on what the research analysts did in those few after hours they might have had.
Well, of course, there's the. Are you talking about the SO2?
Yes, the one with Forrest Anderson.
During the convention, early days, the governor of the state of Montana, who was actually a guy most of us completely agreed and supported with, vetoed some clean air standards involving sulfur dioxide. And the Department of Health, I guess it was the commission, was holding a public meeting for him to explain this. We felt that he'd made a mistake, and organically among us came the idea, well, we should have a demonstration in favor of this. And the only ones who really, we had a lot of Carroll College interns at that time. They'd never been in a political demonstration.
Now you of course had been at UM, so you understood political demonstrations of the time.
Oh yeah, and I'd been in them, and I was also the youngest member of the Republican Party Platform Committee in 1964. I was a teenage Republican. And the only one who asked a question, by the way. But so we organized this, what was supposed to be just a very simple kind of circular picket line outside the hearing, and then we would go in. I remember I was in charge of that, and I couldn't get the kids who'd never been in a demonstration to stop walking in a group. So it looked like, just a group of kids, nothing. Here they come. It was. We didn't change anything, but I think it was important for everybody to see that we did this. And the interesting thing was, several delegates approached us and said, you guys have got to be careful about this. You've got to be careful of your future. I mean, this could really impact your future negatively. And our feeling was we had a moral obligation to stand up for what we thought was right. We were not, and none of us had a sense that, we were going to, that this was the stepping stone to here, to that law firm, to that, no. We just showed up, we did what we could, and then we went to work the next day, and everything was fine.
It's intriguing that having some of the delegates who were concerned about you say, be careful not to hurt your future. requires an understanding of those times, 50 years early from now back, that it's hard for people today probably to understand, if you weren't in that mix, the intensity of the protest movement, the war in Vietnam. If you were going on a march down the streets of Missoula, for example, the FBI had people on the sidelines taking pictures of everybody, and they were going into files. That was a tough time if you were in the protest thing. And I don't think people today, if you weren't around then, it's hard to understand the fear factor.
Yeah, I had, after the Kent State demonstrations, organized Shelby students at the University of Montana to write a very supportive letter, but saying, explain what we were doing, and sent it to the 2 newspapers in Shelby. And even though there were, like, I think 12 of us from Shelby who signed it, everybody knew who did that. And one of the editors of one of the weekly newspapers was on the city council. My summer job that I loved, it was very formative, was working on the city crew of Shelby. He tried to get me fired for having written that letter that he didn't publish, but the other paper did. And the right-wing foreman of the city crew looked at him and said, "This is America. We don't agree with Jim, but he does his work, and you aren't going to fire him for having a different period of beliefs." That man became my hero. And that was the same kind of attitude. I mean, Montanans back then, and it's probably going to sound strange now, they had a sense of community that is no longer that prevalent, I would say. You might disagree with your neighbor, but you trusted him to do the right thing. If you saw a stranger on the highway, obviously with a broken down car, you stopped to help. You didn't care what his bumper sticker said. You didn't care that you knew he was a jerk or disagreed with you. Everybody looked out for everybody else because they knew, coming from this harsh environment state, that if you don't help somebody else when they need help, when you need help, maybe nobody's going to help you. And that cultural feeling is part of, I think, what allowed the Constitutional Convention to happen. People had, thanks to the reporting of Jerry Holleran and a couple others, Chuck Johnson, people had seen that the government wasn't working because of this thing called a Constitution, but we trust ourselves to elect normal citizens to go and fix it.
Yeah. Well, when you think about that, and one of the things I remember writing in a chapter in a book that I helped with, that when the investigative reporters, when the copper press disappeared, and when the Anaconda Company sold its newspapers in 1959 to the Lee newspaper chain, and there were investigative reporters, one of whom was Jerry Holleran, that went to work and started exposing what was going on and shining a light into state government, and what the light revealed was not very attractive. And that really set some of the tone for that convention. And I'll give you just one reflection in a conversational way. Having lived here all this time, with all that I was romanced many a time to move to D.C., and I always said no. But I've stayed in Montana, and I still believe that Montana, although we're over 1 million people and it's getting harder and harder, but it's still kind of like I say, a small town with really long streets, because if you're around long enough, you just seem like you know everybody. Now it's getting harder and harder with the number of people and the intensity of the times, but still there's some of that spirit is still alive in Montana. I
hope the spirit lingers. I think that I almost said, we, we've lost what was called the greatest generation. And our generation was probably the last one. We grew up with that sense of community and the Beatles and Bob Dylan.
Yeah.
And, we also had, access to information that our parents hadn't. And I think our generation, we carried over the good parts of that spirit. And I hope that we pass it on to our grandchildren and, down the line.
Yeah, yeah. By the way, you're mentioning Bob Dylan reminds me of something I wanted to inform our viewers of, because I admire your writing, and the Washington Post recently referred to you in a manner and said that your writing reminded them of both Bob Dylan and George Orwell.
Oh.
And
yeah. I mean, I feel like I should have just gone into a closet after I read that paper. Just, never see that guy again.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that is in the Constitution that's very strong is the right to keep and bear arms. In the Montana Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, and it's actually stronger than the federal. It's not tied to a militia, and it's a very strong provision. And guns were probably not a big, even though they were important, that was, again, not a controversial issue. It was just kind of done. But you had something emerged from that
Yes.
I'd like you to talk about a little bit.
It was, and you had it completely right. Guns were not an issue at the convention among the delegates, really among the staff. I mean, there might be whiffs of like, how can we make sure we fit with the federal Constitution on it? But it was not a big issue. And once, I believe they were the Romney hearings on the Bill of Rights Committee, a group of, I don't want to call them right wing, because that's too limiting. A group of extreme gun lovers mounted an attack against the convention, not for what they were doing, but for perceived things they might be doing. And the way it happened was, one of my friends at the University of Montana was the son of the leader of this group. He came up to my girlfriend, who was back at the University of Montana, worked on the paper, and said, did Jim Grady do a story about Rick Applegate and something about the Vietnam War protests? And how do I find it? And my girlfriend, well, yes, he did. And she helped him find the Montana Kaiman, which is the campus newspaper story. When Benjamin Spock spoke at the University of Montana, a group of
he was a top national figure in the anti-war movement, and a giant celebrity.
Oh yeah, and he'd become a celebrity by taking care of little children. He was one of the first people to make children's health an important national issue. And then he saw his kids that he'd helped grow up being killed in a war that really, we still don't have all the secret reasons why we were there, but we know we shouldn't have been. And so there were protests at the University of Montana. At his speech, a group of University of Montana students, males, came up onto the platform and mailed their draft cards. We all had a little draft card we carried in our wallet back to the Selective Service. Rick Applegate had given the speech, introducing them, explaining why. I was in the audience, and I was on the Montana student paper, and I wasn't assigned for that, but this was a big story. I ran back, I did a story. It ran in the front page of the paper, and that's what this son of one of the extremists found. My girlfriend called me. I said, here's what she was told. The man who had been my friend said, well, we got Applegate now, and it's too bad about Jim. She called me. I called Rick. The Bill of Rights Committee already knew that something was up with this group.
So they were trying to smear Rick and get him probably fired from his job at the Con and
solely because they wanted some stronger provision about guns. That was not even, there was no controversy except from them. So they come down to the Romney hearings for the Bill of Rights Committee. They march in as a group. They pass out to all the delegates and all the people in the who were watching the copy of the Montana Kaiman article that says by Jim Grady, and it was by Rick Applegate. I remember I deliberately waited till the convention was full. Most of the delegates were in their chair. I walked through the center doors as slowly and deliberately as I could. The Bill of Rights Committee was up on the dais. Rick was on there. They were starting the Romney hearings, and I looked around so everybody could see it was me. I sat down next to this wonderful, and I just blanked on her name, the one delegate who never said anything.
Sure.
And she looked at me and she pulled us up and she said, "This is bullshit." And she was a Republican. And we waited, and the man who was a chiropractor.
You're talking about Lynn Sparks?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
From
you, by the way, she was a Democrat.
Was she?
Yeah.
Okay.
See, you can't tell.
You can't tell. Nobody cared. It was, so it's like the leader of the group comes up to the microphone set up for the public, and he starts this rant. And I'm gonna say it was, who was it? Not
Chet.
It was
Chet.
Don Foster.
Oh.
I think had the gavel. Brilliant man, great guy. And he said, "Excuse me, sir, we're talking about, I can't remember, some other provision." He says, "Is what you're saying germane to that?" And the guy kept going. Gavel again. "Excuse me, are you talking about what we're talking about now?" And eventually, the guy at the microphone, the chiropractor who was a gun nut, who said, "No." He said, "Well, sir, that's what this is, and we've got a bunch of citizens behind you who want to talk about that, so you're out of order." He didn't know, the extremist didn't know what to do. He got up, led his people out of the chamber and out of the
Capitol,
out of the balconies where you could watch. I ran as fast as I could, and I stood where they had to walk past me. And as they came past the University of Montana student, looked at me and said, "Hello, Jim," and I gave him one of the hardest looks I ever gave anybody. But it was this strange. The gun rights, the Montana Constitution is probably the strongest legal document in the country about gun rights. And these people, it was an irrational, extreme movement that had somehow sucked people in to believing mere reasoning. It had, other than disrupting the convention and making a lot of people have less time to speak, it didn't have a single effect.
Again, it's reflective of the times, and it also is reflective of there's a lot going on when you're doing your research. They say research analyst, but there's a whole dynamic going on, and citizen participation, that was an aberrant version, but citizen participation was a big part of this. I think How many provisions were? They opened the door and said, "Citizens in across Montana, send us your ideas."
Yes.
And they came by the hundreds.
These people were getting in the way of other people doing that. And they, for example, our committee never closed our door. Think about that. There was the idea that a legislative committee was so open that a lost child could have wandered in. It was we knew that we wanted the citizens of Montana to have no fear about secret deals. We kept we kept our office door open. Most of the time, it was like routine business was going on, but we knew that was important. And I think that is one of the legacies of the Montana Constitution of 1972, open government, citizen participation, and not letting extremists, often well-funded, confuse things with propaganda and misleading information. Come on and look at what's going on for yourself. And that's what the Constitution allows the citizens of Montana to do. I've been bragging about the Constitution of Montana for 50 years now. My friends and family are tired of.
Well, you're right about the legacy of openness. And that shows up in a number of ways in the Constitution. The right to know, which evolved through statute into open meetings. And
oh my God, the idea that, wait a minute, a citizen has the right to know what his government is doing, that should be a fundamental tenet of any democracy. And Montana, I think, was one of, if not the first, certainly one of the first states to even, this was before the Freedom of Information Act in the federal government. This was a revolutionary step done by Main Street Americans.
Yeah, the right to know, combined with, we are actually the only constitution in America that has a constitutional right of participation.
Yes.
When people now go to a public hearing on a bill, or if they go to a public hearing on a rule or regulation a department is doing, or if they're sending in a comment, or if they're just participating in the legislature, all that's embodied in this section of the Constitution that says Montanans have a right to participate in the governmental activities before the decisions are made.
Yes.
And it is the only one that has it. Others have it in their statutes now, but we have it in our Constitution. So that's that legacy of openness and sunshine. You let the sunshine in.
Oh, that was, and I would talk to delegates during the convention, and they became aware of how to even say that. I mean, it was such a revolutionary idea that they had to learn how to express it amongst themselves.
And that was that was of course the legacy. And at the time you were doing it, it was a contrast because the secretive legislature of the 1889 Constitution, when they took up a bill, when they wanted to talk about the bill, the chairman of the committee would say, okay, we're going into executive session. And back then, what that meant was everybody leave. Reporters leave, the author of the bill leave, everybody leave except the committee. They shut the doors, and then they would decide what they were going to do. They would have no public votes. They would have no recorded votes. And when they opened the door and walked out, if you were lucky, the chairman would tell you what they did with the bill. They may not even tell you right then. People were totally in the dark about the secretive legislature and what they did with no recorded votes, no open meetings. We're so used to it now, we think it's a normal thing, but it certainly wasn't normal back then. The operation of the Constitutional Convention was a contrast to what we'd had for 83 years.
Yeah, well, remember, politics comes from the Greek word polis, which is public space, and it is that sense of openness and freedom and responsibility that permeates the legacy of the Montana Constitutional Convention. It's not just enough to know that you have those liberties and rights. You, as a citizen, have to consciously, responsibly, and ethically use those rights. And I think that I hope more generations understand that and follow the lead that we were able to lay the groundwork for. And let's hope it continues to be the basis of honesty in Montana.
You know, as the convention was winding down and finishing its work, and they finished in 54 days, and they had 60, and they were trying to save time in order to save money in anticipation of using some of that money to help promote the Constitution, which the Supreme Court then said you can't do. But in the meantime, they'd wrapped up quick and got it done amazingly in 54 days.
Oh.
Were you on till the end, or did they let you go at a certain point when your work was done?
I was. There were a lot of staffers that had left. I was on staff right towards the end. I didn't care. I think I might have still been on staff, but I was there, for the signing of the Constitution.
That's what I wanted to ask you about, because you were clearly there. And since you were there, and I suspect it might have been that fast writing that kept you there, because there was a lot of editing and stuff at the end. But I wanted to ask about, because someone who was there, because Wade DeHood spoke to this when last time I interviewed him, was he spoke to, even though 8 or 9 of the delegates ended up not wanting to support the Constitution, all 100 came forward. Tell me about that moment. And we're getting close to the end, but go right ahead.
Well, first of all, we didn't know if all of the delegates were going to sign. This was a suspenseful moment, and it was an incredibly. I felt like I was holding back tears. I felt like it was one of those moments that vibrated in not just my history, but in the history of, I would say, the world. It was a very tense, completely public, very solemn situation. And as those delegates came up and one by one signed their name, they would be called, they would come up and they would sign. At a certain point, you knew you had enough to bring it to the voters. But when we realized that all 100 signed that document, that was breathtaking. I remember sort of wandering around in a daze for the rest of the day.
When I spoke to, it was sat in on an interview Wade was doing actually for Montana State University, and they said, what was the most impressive thing about the convention? And he spoke of that moment when all 100 came forward, and he said that when that last 100th one did it, he said he had tears in his eyes. And he had tears in his eyes when he was saying it, and by the way, so did I. So did I.
I mean, it was, you can't, what we had done, what we got to do, what we saw other people picking up and doing was essentially preserving American democracy. And,
Yeah. Well, I'm going to have to cut us off because we're getting to the end, and this has been a marvelous discussion, Jim. Thank you so much, and we'll continue it privately. And for all of our viewers, we look forward to seeing you with the next episode.